Hi, this is Dane Baker, performance dietitian at Access Sports Medicine and professional practice fellow from the University of Otago. You're listening to the Physical Performance Show.
Dane Baker, sports dietitian across the ditch there in New Zealand. Welcome to the Physical Performance Show.
Awesome. Thanks, Brad. Yeah, good to be here.
Dane, I've been looking forward to recording with you for some time. We've been organising this for several months in advance, but we're going to talk about the treatment of low energy availability or relative energy deficiency in sport, which is something that you're not only clinically expertised in, you're also very active in the research front with this. One of our mutual friends, Penny, connected us originally, and she's one of your collaborators with your research there in New Zealand. So welcome along. It's a big topic.
Yeah.
Can you wrap a little bit of context around a typical day in your working life with what you do as a sports dietitian?
Yeah. Thanks for having me. So basically, key part of my role is working at Access Sports Medicine. So I guess I've worked for 10 to 15 years in elite sport with high performance sport, which I guess is the equivalent to the AIS in Australia. I'm working with professional teams, mainly in rugby. So I worked with the Chiefs, Blackburn Sevens, and then with my role in HPS and Z, and especially the Blackburn Sevens, started to really dive deep into REDS, but more around, I guess, applying energy availability with athletes and working in that space and understanding that as a tool to improve performance, but also getting athletes to essentially fuel better. And then that's moved on to now kind of working predominantly more privately with Access Sports Medicine. We have been lucky enough to work sort of collaboratively as part of a multidisciplinary clinic with REDS. So yeah, extremely fortunate just to meet these specialists and then work with their patients who see these REDS patients or hypothalamic amenorrhea sort of every day, and working collaboratively with them as part of the journey to recovery. So yeah, it's been an awesome experience. And then now starting to look a bit deeper into research around the recovery process, especially with a nutrition lens on, it's been really good.
The recovery process from relative energy deficiency or low energy availability state.
Yeah, exactly. So working with a diagnosed group, so that's been a big difference probably from working in elite sport where you just don't have that. I think it's getting better, but working with these specialists that really have a specific recovery plan in place, and being able to work with them and collaborate and follow up and see the progress, the blood work, the clinical workups that are done on these patients, and then being able to see them recover. And a big part of that is putting a nutrition plan in place, and that's sort of what I specialize in and probably most of my energy is put into these days.
Dane, should we just get some definitions sort of laid down? People hear these terms. Fortunately, the awareness is really growing. I work predominantly in endurance sport, and it's great that this is now, the message of fueling is starting to, become pervasive. But when you mention low energy availability and RED-S or REDS, can you describe what they are and what's the difference?
Yeah, so REDS essentially stands for relative energy deficiency in sport. And I guess the key word there is energy deficiency. And how we define energy deficiency comes from this term in nutrition around energy availability, where I guess in simple terms, a lot of time you might think of nutrition as energy balance, which is calories go in, calories go out. You might think body weight either goes up or down. The problem with that is that our body easily adapts. So you can be in a negative energy balance, but your weight becomes stable because underneath your body's down-regulated. So it's what we call metabolic adaptation. And what energy availability looks like is the core amount of energy that your body has left over for these key systems. So what REDS is, basically, it's the physiological down functioning of a lot of those key systems like the bone, the muscle, cells, thermoregulation. Everything starts to be affected. And I guess REDS is an expansion from the female athlete triad, which you might have heard about years ago, which is essentially just the axis of low energy availability affects bone, affects menstrual function, and they all kind of interact. And what REDS really expanded on was all of these other systems in the body that are affected by that low energy availability. So that's really that low energy availability is a I guess a platform that we use in nutrition.
And many people, and we'll put this up in the show notes, Dane, as a reference, but will be familiar with that hub and spoke, diagram of relative energy deficiency with all the different systems that can be affected, including the gastrointestinal system, the sexual function. There's barely a system that doesn't get affected. Can you just go back there, Dane? Because this is a question that often comes up is how can I be maintaining weight but still in a state of low energy availability or caloric deficit? So you mentioned everything gets down regulated, but can you just explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, so I guess it's that's where the body weight becomes a really tricky part of this, and it's sort of tricky to get your head around, especially even when you're a nutrition student, is that what we often see in clinic, let's just say an example could be you've got an athlete that's 54 kilograms, she's an endurance runner, that body weight stayed stable for quite some time, but there's sort of reds going on in the background, there's chronic underfueling, but essentially the body's got to that set point where it's just turning everything right down underneath. And this has been shown, so in research, especially in really high controlled settings, you can test resting metabolic rate, which is a tool that you can use, which needs a lot of control. So it's mainly used more in a research setting or somewhere like the AIS, where you can actually evaluate just how down-regulated the metabolic rate is. And that's actually a really key kind of diagnostic tool that can be used in research. But that's what's happening. So it's kind of explaining that to an athlete that you're underfueling, but just because that weight's stable doesn't mean you're in a state of balance. Your body is in a balance, but it's been negatively kind of down-regulated to achieve that. Where what energy availability works, and when you'll see these ratios of essentially how many calories per kilogram of fat-free mass are left over to the athlete. And that's where we've seen a lot of the research done, especially by Anne Locks, where she's put participants on varying levels of how much energy is left over, and then just assessed how much negative impact that's had on menstrual function, reproductive hormone levels, bone health, gut health. So we've seen these kind of, I guess, ratios that we've seen in research, but then starting to see that in real life as well, which is a little bit harder to measure, obviously, when you don't have the controls of putting someone in a metabolic ward.
Yeah, you mean like to scientifically calculate resting metabolic rate?
Yeah. And so that's when you'll often see energy availability. It can be a bit confusing. You might see 45, these ratios, thresholds of 30. And what that's meaning is 30 calories per kilogram of fat-free mass. So we're using like a core measurement of how many calories are left over. And so that's sort of what I've really got interested in, is just applying this to athletes, to individuals, as I guess the core part of the nutrition. And it's really been interesting to see the buy-in, because obviously as sports dietitians, we're focused on carbohydrate intakes, fueling, protein, but trying to put it together around energy availability has been a bit of a passion of mine over the last sort of few years.
And it's great to have people like yourself so passionate about it, because I'm a frontline clinician working with endurance athletes. So we're dealing with tendon concerns, but it's, a heap of bone stress injuries. And you cannot have a conversation about bone stress injury recovery without thinking about the energy availability of an athlete. So the work that you do with your colleagues, Dane, is just so pivotal.
Yeah, and that's what we'll often see in the clinic. That can be the first presentation, as obvious, could be a stress fracture or a stress injury, and then the clinician will dig a little bit deeper and then probably have the diagnosis of RED-S, and then that diagnosis is a really important part of my work. That's what I've found, especially working with reproductive endocrinologists and sports physicians who will make the diagnosis. And I think having that diagnosis is a really key part of the buy-in for the patient to then have a really proactive approach to working on fueling, where often sports dietitians in the field, someone's under fueling, but it can be really hard it's not easy for people to really increase that fueling level. So there's a strong sort of motivation when there is a diagnosis.
Interesting. I find clinically there's sometimes not a pushback, but maybe you could call it that, about the consideration that they might even be possibly underfueled. Well, where things will come up like, I eat so much. There might be a parent with a teenage adolescent athlete, and it's often like they eat really well. He's always eating, she's always eating, always has food in their face, and it's not my domain. That's why we obviously so closely work with great sports dietitians like yourself. But I find it tricky. Any tips for the frontline clinicians out there, where if they suspect someone might be in a state of energy deficiency, to try and capture the athlete's attention to give this consideration?
Yeah, so I guess one of the key things we're learning in the awareness is around menstrual cycle. And we see a lot of athletes now that are tracking their cycle. So that can be the first sort of clue. If they're taking any sort of oral contraceptive pill, then that will mask the cycle. So that's often can rule out quite a few of the athletes. But that's an area that's really growing, and a lot of young athletes, elite athletes, will use it as a real key training monitoring tool. I think going back to your question is it's exactly what I see as well. So I try to kind of, the way I work with the athlete will be doing a big assessment interview, but then actually working out their energy availability based on their training load. And so essentially I'm kind of going through their microcycle across the training week, their Monday to Sunday, what they're doing, different times of training, but then showing them what it would look like for optimal levels of energy availability, and sort of essentially kind of finding the gaps where they might be under fueling. And that seems to be a really key process in them buying into it, rather than, like you said, me just saying, I think you need to eat a bit more of this here or there. It kind of just becomes opinion. We're trying to keep it nice and scientific. The athletes really sort of buy into that, but not everyone buys in. But I think that diagnosis is a big turning point for them as well.
Yeah, I find injury minimization prevention has some ability to have people engage with the concept, but then if you talk about performance and the possibility that they're underperforming, not adapting to training as well, that tends to, I find, be sometimes more of an anchor for them.
Yes, yeah, and we've just seen that with Penny's research. So we've kind of gone back and surveyed about 155 patients that have been on the recovery process from REDS, and really a key part of it was that learning about what energy availability is and how it affects health and performance. So it's kind of like, they kind of refer to it as that light bulb moment of, okay, I can see what's actually happening to my body and how it's related to my fueling levels. So you're really trying to bring in both aspects.
And athletes surprised, I imagine they would be, when you actually detail what energy requirement they should have and what they're actually doing. I imagine there's a few light bulbs that go off with a bit of probably almost shock. So we've actually, I don't want to give too much of Penny's research because we haven't got it published yet, but we found about like 92% underestimated what they're eating. And we've seen that in lots of other research as well, is that most athletes underestimate their fueling requirements. And a lot of that as well, as we know that appetite doesn't track with energy output. So often in studies where we increase training load by 30%, maybe 30% of the athletes might increase their intake, and maybe 50% will actually reduce. So appetite is a big part of this, and that's why if you look at Anne Lox's work, she's a big proponent of eating to a regime rather than relying on appetite, and that's where athletes can get into a lot of trouble. So, and that's where we work a lot with the more inadvertent underfueling, rather than there could be a clear sort of eating disorder diagnosis, and then we'll sort of refer more to the specialist clinical teams around that area. Yeah, that's I guess a key distinction, isn't it, Dane? The unintentional underfueling versus the disordered eating / diagnostically diagnosed eating disorder presentation.
Yeah, and there is a long sort of spectrum as well. I think there'll always be an element of body image or disordered eating, but I guess at the very clinical disordered side of that spectrum, that's where we need those sort of clinical skills. But what we often work with patients that have recovered from that process and are now starting to exercise more, and I think that's really where the sports dietitian is a really important part of those clinical eating disorder teams, because there seems to be a lack of connect around bringing back someone from a really just core eating disorder thing and starting to get them to train and exercise more and putting the strategies around that. And that's often, so we work a lot in that space as well.
Dane, what questions would you ask on the front line as a practicing clinician to get an insight into the athlete's energy availability or energy balance? Like, what questions do you ask to sort of start to get a feel for whether they're
Yeah, so I guess it's all part of the clinical, assessment that I do. So we've kind of come to a system where I spend about an hour in the assessment, and half of that or 3/4 of that might be around trying to assess their energy availability. So we actually use like an online kind of food journal, which we're not getting anyone to count calories. They're just posting their meals. It's all private. Some will do that, some won't. But then we'll go for a big dietary history. And then what those photos actually help with is just trying to assess portion size. So you can actually start to get a feel for the volume that they're eating in those meals. We know that, and that's the limitations in the field. If you assess someone's energy intake for a food record, there can be 20 to 30% of error in that. And then the other side of that is trying to understand what they're doing from a training perspective. So we'll go through each day of training, different sessions, how long they're going for. We can also, a lot of them will have devices. So they might be wearing like their Garmin watch, and they'll have access to kind of some pretty raw information around energy expenditure. You can use how quickly they're running, speeds, all those kind of things to try to get an understanding of energy expenditure. And that's pretty much what I'm doing. And then what I'll go away and do then is put the plan together based on how much energy they need and how we're going to structure that. And pretty much the goal from there is working on each meal and each snack, working with what they're currently eating. So if they're eating oats, making sure we're building that up to the right portion. So we're not making wholesale changes. We're trying to work with, trying to get the behavior change so they can buy into it, rather than we're not just using a generic plan and here you go, here's a fuel plan. It's really specific to their culture, to their intake, to their tastes. And a big part of this is appetite as well. So it all comes back to sort of sports nutrition around training the gut, being able to get athletes to be able to tolerate more fuel when they're exercising. I guess the ways you go around that, and also working with their appetite. So quite often someone can be quite significantly underfueled, and we know we need to get them a lot higher. So it can be a step-by-step process. It might be getting halfway in the first 2 or 3 months and then trying to keep pushing over the next 3 or 4 months.
So that's an interesting point. You can't go from here to here necessarily overnight with intake and output. It makes sense working with athletes anyway. The small changes are sometimes the way to go. So, but it can take months, obviously, to... Yeah. And I think I try to make sure I outline what they're going to need, because I might only see them once or twice, especially in a private setting, where a lot of this relies on health insurance or user pays. So rather than if you were, I guess, in an Olympic setup, you might have access every week to that athlete and you could work on those small changes. But I do think there's relevance in showing someone what optimal energy availability looks like, rather than saying, let's just start halfway, but let's show you what the big picture looks like and let's see how, let's build up to this. Another part of that is probably the relationship with the clinician. So whether that's the endocrinologist or the sports physician around, especially if they're not an elite athlete, about maybe reducing some of that energy expenditure. So maybe they're going to the gym twice a day. Could we reduce that? Could we maybe start implementing 1 or 2 rest days in the week? And all this will be able to help that energy availability, because they could fuel with what they need to do. But like you said, it's going to be a significant jump that might be quite unrealistic. So it's kind of finding a bit of middle ground. But obviously with an elite athlete, it's a bit of a different conversation, because we've still got some high, volume of training. So it's all really patient specific, and I guess where they are, they might be injured. So then that's a different scenario as well. Yeah. And I mean, as you say, everyone's different. Everyone's got different outputs, training requirements. You mentioned strength training, strength and conditioning. I find that an interesting space as a sports physio when someone's returning to participation sport off the back of whatever injury, and they're needing strength and conditioning often for that process. And it's trying to educate, or at least enlighten the athlete to the fact that, hey, you're about to throw this on top now. You need to fuel for that as well. And sometimes I find that with a blank stare, it's like, well, it's just gym work. It's like, no, it's not just gym work. Yep.
And I guess the real struggle we see is the adolescent athlete. So playing multiple sports, and you go through their sort of training week with their parents, and it's, some of these, we've got 14-year-olds training 25 hours a week a lot of the time. And so it's just the volume of training is immense. And often, especially when there's like swimming, there's water polo, there's hockey, or there's maybe you've got a middle distance runner that's really good at field hockey, and all of a sudden you've got a huge energy expenditure going on. So just even that process in itself can be quite powerful to go, okay, there's a lot of training here, and maybe there's a discussion with your coach around, how you're putting your week together, I think is really important.
I mean, what tips would you give to parents out there who have active children? They, try their best, but is there any real practical tips? I know this is a broad question.
Yeah. I think going back to that, I think it's probably just keeping in good contact with the coaches. So often we'll have a hockey coach and a middle distance running, and they're both just working independently. So trying to actually understand what they're doing on their recovery days, like a swimmer, they might be doing a classic swim program and they might have Wednesday afternoon off, and now that's being filled up with 3 water polo sessions, and then they're wondering why they're fatigued on a Thursday morning. And so those kind of things. But I think from a nutrition perspective, it's really just making sure. I think the take-home messages are probably really pay close attention to pre, during, post-exercise. If you can start putting those pieces together with a good, sound diet, you're going to get a lot of the way there. But too often to fuel to that level is not easy, and often appetite won't be enough, and you need some pretty aggressive fueling a lot of the time. So
being aware of pre and post exercise intake, as you say, you need to sometimes be quite aggressive because the output's so high. Yep. Obviously, it's driven by dietary preferences and all different things, but any little gems that you've gone, oh, geez, that's a surefire way to help the athlete here?
Yeah. So what I often find is that first hour after training. So even if you're going home for a meal, but you've done 2 trainings or a big training, thinking about that first wave of recovery, that might be a liquid option, could be a smoothie, it could be flavored milk, it could be like a recovery formula, it could be food. But one of the things is often appetite can be pretty limited, especially if you've done a high intensity session.
Yep.
And it's more just the windows of opportunity you've got to get more energy in, because a lot of these, you can be really busy with school, with work, and you're needing to find windows to get this energy in. And often that's an important window. The second probably important part is that fueling during exercise, if it's long enough and it's hard enough. And I think most people underestimate how hard they're training. And we found this in our retrospective stuff just recently, that was the hardest thing for athletes to implement, was fueling during exercise. I think that's coming back to a lot of the, concern around sugar intake, which is relevant to those with obesity and our general population, but those at those high performing ends, when these trainings are pretty challenging, that's a key part, especially when you're going out for a 3-hour ride. We get a lot of patients that are just fueling with nothing on these long weekend rides. So that's a real key piece a lot of the time. And then it's just real close attention to your portions with your meals. So we work a lot with that and what that meal looks like. And often a lot of the energy dense stuff has been taken out. So we see a lot of dairy taken out. We see a lot of gluten taken out because there may be some concerns around GI issues, which often are highly prevalent in REDS patients. So we're just trying to get the fueling right and putting the big blocks in place. Your routine at school can be really important, like getting that consistent. Probably another gem is always that post-morning session. So if you've got someone that's going to school, they've had something to eat before training, there's often that missing period from 8 till 10 o'clock, and they're training in the pool in the afternoon. We've missed a real important window to refuel.
So lots of great tips there, Dane. Just looping back to the fueling during exercise piece, this show's followed by mostly endurance athletes. And like you say, they'll go out and do multiple hours for a long training session. Do you mean sometimes there's a concern about the amount of sugar that people are having and therefore they don't fuel for those sessions? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, I definitely. And I think from an adolescent athlete, so I'm saying adolescent a lot because we do see a lot of adolescent REDS patients. You might have an adult that's on their journey around weight loss or reducing carbohydrate intake because they're just not doing the output. But then you've got a really active swimmer or cyclist that's going to need additional fuel. And I think what we're learning around fueling during exercise is being able to train the gut. So if you're going to go out and run your 3 or 4 hour marathon, you've got to be able to prepare your gut to be able to tolerate that level of carbohydrate. So we're not talking every session, coming back to what a lot of Louise Burke's work's looked at is carbohydrate availability. What session do you need carbohydrate? For some of these kids, it's a lot of sessions when they're doing 2-hour swims, 5-6 times a week. So it can be pretty challenging. And then it's just learning the intensity, the hard sessions. I think the other really growing area is around carbohydrate intake and bone metabolism. So I know Louise has done a lot of work in that with race walkers, Craig Sale in the UK, and that's a really interesting area around long duration exercise, no carbohydrate. We're seeing some impairments around bone metabolism. So again, for these athletes that are at high risk of bone injuries, it's an important area.
Yeah, and the bone health side of this consideration is just enormous. I mean, we know that once an athlete's had one bone stress injury in their athletic career, males 6.8 times more likely to have another one, females 6 times more likely. It is a very challenging space to get them out of the repeat cycle of further bone stress injuries. The paper I often try and show to help educate, to create awareness of the challenge here, Dane, is where one of the works shows that if you have 3 to 4 risk factors for energy availability being low or red S, you may be 6 to 8 times more likely to have a bone stress injury. And if you combine that with low bone health or poor bone health, you might be 15 times more likely. And when you start to see some of the science, I find managing bone stress injuries one of the most complex, difficult parts of my job. It is very challenging.
Yeah. I mean, it's devastating for an athlete. We have quite a few patients that are based, New Zealanders that'll be based in the States as track runners and NCAA. And just once, like you said, once they've had one, the risk is there, and you get that email from the physician that they've had another one, and just the emotion. And I think that's where the context of nutrition gets lost. So we have these interventions or these pieces of research that might focus on one niche area of metabolism, but that have overwhelming consequences for the rest. So I think, that's where I think putting everything as a whole is really important from the nutritional side of things around energy availability, carbohydrate availability. These are the key rocks for a lot of our developing athletes to make sure they're getting right.
And clinically, I think people often want to not demonize, but attribute the bone stress injury to the training workload, which we know is obviously paramount. But clinically, I think the bigger underlying issue and rock is the energy availability side. So I think most bone stress injuries that present to me in endurance sports need some sort of dietetic input to look at this energy availability. Yeah, and
that's where we're lucky at Access. Obviously, we have lots of sports physicians that understand this, and so see a lot of patients that are referred for that. And I also think sometimes there is a huge amount of this can be load related, but my sort of message is the recovery is going to be really important around energy availability to make sure that's optimized for the optimal level of healing. So I think regardless of the cause, the energy availability plays a huge part in the recovery of this as well. So that's where we do a lot of work in that with patients at Access as well.
Very practical here, Dane. Would you mind us sharing for the athlete listening in that might be wondering if they're potentially in a state of energy deficiency, what the indirect signs are that they should look for the male athlete, the female athlete? Would you mind walking through?
Yeah, so I guess it's for the athlete. One worrying, I guess there's two ways to this. So the diagnosis of RED-S is quite challenging. So if you talk to the specialist, they will say it's a diagnosis of excluding a lot of other factors. And I would definitely recommend, if you are concerned, to first start with your GP and then maybe work towards seeing a specialist, because they need to go through quite a lot of processes to ensure that it is actually an energy deficiency and rule out tumours, remove a lot of other, it could be PCOS from a female health perspective. So there are things we need to rule out rather than just jumping straight to RED-S. But I guess, like we said earlier, tracking menstrual cycle, that's the biggest physiological warning that unfortunately males don't have. There's a lot of work going on at the moment with males around maybe looking at questionnaires. I guess tracking your, like you would as an athlete, your daily wellness around your fatigue levels. And I think we do a lot of work in coach education around that, and just being able to assess like impairments in training. Obviously there'll be a high level of fatigue, but trying to understand when that's getting a little bit too much. And I guess having those conversations with the coach, that's probably the key part. thinking about mood, and obviously, like you said, like injury, repeated injury. And especially in males, we've seen like reduced libido, just reduced energy. With females, we also see like a brain fog, a concentration issue. One of the most common things we often see as well is GI issues. So we can see bloating, we can see kind of constipation, impaired bowel motions, and this often causes the patient to start looking at dietary restrictions. Maybe they might go to a naturopath, they might get given a whole lot of supplements, maybe they take gluten and dairy out, and these things may work slightly, but essentially what we've seen is that gut's just down-regulated. We've actually seen from our research when we just survey these patients that there's quite a significant improvement in appetite and GI function as they recover. So if you are experiencing those things, then it's definitely worth. In New Zealand, we do a lot of work with GP education, so that's the first port of call, and then to move on. But it could be just, if you've got support team, talking to your physio, talking to your doctor, your trainer, if you do have a dietitian. Because the way I think of energy availability, it's not just using it when someone's energy deficient. We should be using this to optimize performance. And that's essentially just trying to fuel across the different days of training and get that right. And when you do get that right, we often see athletes at their leanest, at their strongest, and they're more resilient to injury and illness as well.
So much there, Dana. Makes me think of a couple of prior points that former guests, colleagues of yours have mentioned on the show. Margot Mountjoy, Dr. Mountjoy, who's been so instrumental in this field with the shift in from energy from female athlete triad to Red S. I recall a story that she shared, Dane, and that was one of her patients, male patients, who was in a state of Reds, and he went from not noticing female as in his class at uni to all of a sudden being like, wow, there's all these good-looking girls in class, and Margot's like, great, this is a good sign of recovery.
Yep. Yeah, and I think I've heard Greg Shaw, you might know in the Gold Coast here, but he talks about that as well, that, young guys should be going out there and having lots of energy, and if they're withheld, and especially looking at them at training. I think body language at training, I know coaches get really good at that, understand the body language of their athletes. And it's just what we're learning with energy availability. I think Louise Burke put this really well. You can kind of think it about like alcohol. A little bit of alcohol every now and then is not going to, cause a lot of health problems. But when you're chronically exposed to LEA, that's when the problems occur. And we know in a training week, there may be periods where there's a little bit of low energy availability, but we're looking at the big picture. And ideally, we try to pick that up with monitoring. And that's why we always see a high prevalence of REDs in the recreational athletes or the non-elite, because those elite settings tend to pick it up a bit quicker with the support networks.
And certainly in that recreational setting or recreationally competitive athlete day, and there still tends to be that pervasive thought that in endurance sports, in leanness sports, that lighter is better. And I find most days in clinical practice, I'm having some sort of conversation to try and shift their thinking around that. Yep.
It's something that, even though I keep thinking we're doing a really good job in education, I'll still get a really good athlete coming in with that's been the message from the coach, even at an adolescent level. And I think the good thing now is that there's more information for these athletes and parents to question that, which is good. But you're right, like it's the first thing that often someone goes to is, let's reduce body weight. In some situations, that could be helpful, but the first thing is you want to do it in a really well-controlled way. If that energy deficit gets too quick, too sharp, then you're going to start to get into trouble. Also, the way you present that around body image and, buy-in with the athlete is super important to keep them confident and to not, predispose them to any disordered eating. But again, like we know that just losing body weight, that we might lose a bit of body mass, but we could have a lot of significant issues around performance and health.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's that idea that people need to be lean all year to perform at their best, but your colleague in research, Trent Stellingworth, commented that might only be applicable done very well once a year or once a season, that periodizing of body weight. Body composition, I should say.
Yeah, absolutely. And getting athletes to train like he suggests with just good energy availability. It might be just those 2 or 3 months leading into competition where you're really subtly reducing that energy availability, but in a controlled way. And I think having in those situations, especially in those elite settings, you've got a lot of monitoring going on, so you can understand what's happening. These athletes aren't just left to their own devices for the 6 months afterwards. So yeah, it is a lot harder in that sort of non-elite setting to do these things.
I find though the distance triathletes, long course, they don't mind doing whatever's needed to try and. They're probably one group that's great to work with, where they're like, what do I have to do to make sure I'm on the start line, not injured, and also performing?
Yeah,
there's different motivations, isn't there? But how important, Dane, is objective data, like using something like a body composition scan, which fortunately here in Australia are not that expensive, done at a radiology clinic. I mean, I find it quite imperative to have bone mineral density checks done for the right athlete. How important are things like body composition scans out there, Dane?
Yeah, I mean, they can be. In New Zealand, we don't really have access to DEXA for body composition, just for our health system. It's a lot harder. It's a lot more expensive. I don't do any body composition tests in clinic through skin folds, because that can be quite invasive and probably more stressful to the patient. So with the energy availability, we can actually estimate that fat-free mass without making big errors in the energy availability requirement. But I think I have seen a few, especially a good example is I've been working quite closely with a couple of elite ballet dancers that are based in the Gold Coast, and talking to colleagues over there, and we've found ways that we can look at their bone density, where we might have an intervention where just because of the nature of the sport, they've needed to lose 2 to 3 kilograms, and we've looked, okay, how do we do this safely? We've looked at bone density over every sort of 3 to 6 months. We look at menstrual cycle, we look at reproductive hormones, and we can check in the background all of these are still optimized. So in that setting, that can be really, really useful. So I think having a good understanding of bone density, body composition, but I do also think it's really individual, because a lot of patients will present because there is that concern around body image, disordered eating. So having an over focus on body composition tests can be, not that helpful in a lot of situations. So I guess it's just using your practitioner hat on around how you might go about that. But definitely from a monitoring perspective, DEXA, if you're able to do RMR testing, we did a lot of that with our sevens players. It's almost like a bit of a warrant of fitness that goes on in the background, iron levels. And so you're just trying to pick things up before they start going down, and menstrual cycle as well, if you can assess that.
Mention iron. That's something that, correct me if I'm wrong, but you typically see there's an iron deficiency when someone's not having enough energy available. Makes sense, right? You're not getting enough in, you're not going to have enough iron. Yeah,
exactly. And it's something, and that's where that whole REDS kind of got expanded from just the axis model of the female athlete triad. And we also know that around iron, the absorption can be impaired. So your colleagues in Australia around hepcidin, and the more inflammation, the impairment of iron absorption. And we often see that in our LEA patients, just more inflammation, underfueling. All of this impacts on iron metabolism.
Which totally makes sense. Dane, how prevalent is this in the sporting community? And that's a very broad question. I appreciate. Yeah. When I've looked into some research for distance running, it's, we're talking about high prevalence here. What's your sort of clinical / research take on it? Yeah, so we've seen, like, when you look at those elite settings of the elite sort of marathon, your middle distance running, it's anywhere from 50 to 80%, are at risk. And so a lot of these research studies will use like a leaf Q. So they're assessing the risk of low energy availability. It doesn't mean that these are diagnosed. And I guess anyone at that elite setting of endurance athletes is essentially walking a bit of a tightrope for low energy availability. But there's been work done from my colleagues at Otago University. We've looked at recreational athletes. And so just your typical female gym goers going to the gym, doing exercise sessions. And what we've found there is there's about a 50% prevalence or risk of low energy availability. And what we often say is 80% of the population, there's a focus on reducing body weight. 80% prevalence of obesity, inactivity, especially in our adolescents. But there's that 20% of the population that are active that we know are at risk of LEA. So it's extremely, I think, if you're working with female
patients or athletes, it should be front of mind, especially if they're active. And I think from that research, it showed every hour of exercise done in the week, there was almost a twofold increase in the prevalence or the risk. So just the more volume, the more risk. But it does get muddled with a lot of our public health messages are around, because so much of the population will benefit from losing weight. Those messages get pushed on to our active population.
Yeah, that makes sense. There's a muddying of waters from, lose weight, stay healthy versus, but then you've got this active population where the message should almost be make sure you eat enough.
Yeah, yep. And hopefully it's getting there. Like we've got really good colleagues in New Zealand like Stacey Sims, who's really creating some really good messages for a lot of female athletes around the importance of fueling for health and performance. I think people are starting to understand that you can fuel and perform and be healthier rather than, and it's just changing that mindset.
Yeah, so powerful. Dane, recovery timelines, any insight you'd share? I suspect the longer someone's been in a state of low energy availability or REDS, the longer it will take to restore the athlete, the patient back to health and performance. Any tips you'd share there or insights? Yeah,
so we often say, the specialists will often say it's about a 12 to 24 month process in some situations to restore regular cycles and consistency. It may be shorter, like you said, if someone's just recently kind of fallen into low energy availability and there's a good attitude to nutrition, it can be quite quick. But what we're looking at, often a lot of patients will see their baby long-term amenorrhea for maybe 6 to 12 months at least. And whilst we're working with energy availability to restore a menstrual cycle, the key challenge there is trying to create a regular cycle. So having the cycle between 28 to 35 days, having ovulatory cycles, these are all the things that the specialist is assessing over the recovery process. And that's important because that's when those hormones, reproductive hormones, are optimized to support bone, to support muscle. So even though we can have a menstrual cycle, if it's not regular, we're still at risk of sort of that down regulation in bone. So that's what, and there's been a study, I think the BJSM 2014 talked about the recovery process where it can be days to restore it from a nutrition perspective. It may be months to restore the menstrual cycle, but it can be 1 to 2 years to actually then start impacting on bone. So we'd rather not get into the situation of having to recover, and avoiding it is definitely the preferred option.
What barriers do you see athletes, patients encounter when they are trying to, recover from REDS?
Yeah, I think it's the long-term nature, and that can be quite frustrating. And I think that's why it's so important to have a physician coordinate the recovery, because it's just not going to be a one-off and you'll go away and we'll see you in 6 months' time. Some it can be quite straightforward. Some we're working with patients for a couple of years. And because to increase your energy intake has caused a lot of anxiety, it can cause a lot of stress, can cause some weight gain initially. And so a lot of people, especially if there's a background of disordered eating or body composition concerns, that's not easy. And we do get a lot of patients looking for the quick fix. So they might be taking a supplement. They might go look for an alternative health provider. That might give them, some magic bullet, but they end up coming back because this is an energy deficiency. So it's trying to keep them engaged over that time period. And that's where I think the diagnosis, the multidiscipline support, psychology input, sports physician, endocrinology, nutrition, we all play a part in trying to connect the dots to help them recover.
Such a great point. The multidisciplinary care. It's in Australia. I find, Dane, sports physicians, which are distinct from a general practitioner, medical doctor, so key in our healthcare system in Australia for really driving this process, for doing the metabolic workup to check for any other potential cause for this.
Yeah, and I guess it's everyone working together with the same message. I think that's key, because there are some great work, but if you're going off and doing it and not bringing it back to everyone's connected, and I think that's been the great thing working privately, is we have this great form of communication with letters and everyone's involved, and it's a really collaborative process where some sports, like it hasn't always been that perfect, where I think that's the key is, and I know I've worked a bit with your colleagues in Australia, and that's an area they're trying to really improve on, is getting the communication from the doctors to the nutritionists, the dietitians, everyone sort of involved.
Yeah, it's a big process, but such an important one. Dane, these questions can be challenging because there's always context to individuals' presentations. But would you share 3 top tips for the athlete out there that is on a recovery from RED-S?
Yep. Probably the key thing, which we haven't touched on so much today, is around spreading out your energy. So concept we sort of call energy distribution. So that can be just as important as much as how much energy you're consuming in the day. So I would really focus on morning nutrition and just spreading out your meals and snacks more consistently across the day and kind of eat to a bit of a routine. And then the second part would be think about your pre, your during, and post nutrition. Think about those windows. Are you getting those right? I think the last piece would be, at first, it will be a bit of a challenge gut-wise, but your gut will adapt. It will get more efficient. Appetite starts to return. So just hang in there and maybe start slowly. And I think that's why working with a sports dietitian can be really valuable and help. And there's some GI function issues that you want to get diagnosed as well. So we can't rule those out. So all of these things are sort of important parts of the jigsaw.
I'll just recap those, Dane. They're brilliant. 3 top tips for the athlete recovering: spread out your energy distribution. Think about eating to a routine.
Yep.
Second point you made was pay close attention to pre, during, and post nutrition intake with around that training. And third, there was be aware that there might be a bit of a gut challenge with this shift in intake, and you've got to therefore start slowly.
Yeah, and think long term. I think that's the key. Think about this as a 12-month process. And that's where I think follow-up is important, because we're lucky enough to work with specialists where we can, each month they can get a blood test and we can start to see those reproductive hormones, and we can start to get some feedback that the fueling's really working. If you're just kind of waiting for the first period of the menstrual cycle to start, it can get quite frustrating. So I think that having that kind of follow-up process is really important and can give a lot of confidence to what you're doing is right.
Gosh, that's powerful. I see the athlete might, visit a dietitian, hopefully a sports-based one, because of the nuances, and for whatever reason, the follow-up sometimes falls down, and then they'll represent with another bone injury, and it's like, oh gosh, like this needs to be monitored for a long time. I find that clinically frustrating.
Yep. Yeah, and I think that's where the multidisciplinary approach can be really helpful, because it might be the dietitian's not following them up every 2 or 3 months, but there might be the physio, they're communicating back, this is what we're seeing, the doctor, the reproductive endocrinologist. So I think all of that communication being combined can be really powerful, and someone saying, okay, I actually think you need another session with the dietitian, or no, we really need to work on your training and your rehab. And that's where I think that coordinated approach is so important.
Dane, you've been very generous with your time. Every guest of the show gets issued a couple of set questions. One, if you could boil everything you've learned down into one piece of advice for the athlete out there trying to perform at their best, what would your single piece of advice be?
I think it's hard to put one, but I think just you don't get caught into the pseudoscience of it all, because I think we're just faced with so much misinformation. If you are concerned or you're looking to have a lifestyle change, really try to talk to someone in that field, whether it's training, whether it's nutrition, whether it's your injury, talk to someone properly, because I think we're just inundated with apps, with information, and people are getting lost out there. So speak to someone that just does this day in, day out.
Yeah, that's great advice. I mean, so good, so powerful and pertinent. And Dane, every guest of the show issues listeners with a physical challenge for the week. Now, you can turn this on its head and it might be non-physical, but what would Dane's physical challenge be for the week?
I think I think one of the key things for me, I used to surf a lot. Now I'm a keen fisherman. I just get outside and get in the water or get moving. If you can do that, look after yourself a bit. I think it's easy to get caught up with just working. You've got to take time out to get some exercise and get outside.
Yeah, beautiful. Dane, you mentioned not getting caught up in the pseudoscience. Your work is far from being pseudoscience. It's very scientifically driven, the clinical research side of it. What's coming up that you're excited about in the research space?
Yeah, so we're just in the process of Penny's just got her first review. She's our PhD student that's doing a great job and really leading the area in this space for us over in New Zealand. We're just about to start a study with your colleagues in Bond University. So we're looking at continuous blood glucose monitors in our REDS patients. So we've teamed up with Greg Cox and Vernon Coffey around that to help us. They're doing a lot of work in this space. And I think one of the things that Greg's looking at is this could be a really useful tool for patients to kind of understand and get some feedback around their fueling strategies. So we're just going to test that out. And we do know that blood glucose metabolism is affected in patients with REDS. So we're going to compare a REDS group to a non-REDS group and see what the differences are as a bit of a pilot work. So that's exciting. So just trying to keep up with the technology, but also understand if the technology is actually relevant to our group and, what are we learning and is the data actually accurate?
Yeah, lots going on. As I sit here, Bond University is 2 kilometres to the right of me. So that's quite
nice.
Isn't it? Yep. Very close to home. Dane, thank you for stopping by and sharing, this some of your incredible knowledge in this space. It's such a key area. And wish you all the best for the rest of the year and for all the research that's being output, and keep up the good work in clinical practice.
Awesome. Thanks, Brad. Thanks for having me.